All right, let's talk about the difference between domain and range. Domain, I give you a quick definition, a definition that I think makes sense. It is all the x values left to right, but it describes the x values in particular of the entire graph, the entire function. So if we got a picture of this graph, we just want to look to see where is this graph in terms of x. So we want to describe this graph in terms of x. Well, I see that there's three different sections here. There's one, there's two, and there's like a third section. So I gotta really say that there are three sections to the graph, and I want to say where those sections are in terms of x. All right, so let's look at this first section over here on the left. All right, where does that section of graph go in terms of its x values? Well, I can see an arrow pointing left, so it's going to go from negative infinity, and I can see that arrow, and I'm reading this in terms of x values going to the right, and it's going to stop when it gets to this dotted line, that asymptote. So the first section of our graph is from negative infinity to -2. All right, so if I were to maybe put like a section label on there, that's like section A, okay? Now, we're going to have three total because there's another one right here in the middle. And I want to say, where does that section of graph go from? Well, let's look at the kind of graph itself. And it looks like it's kind of in between these two dotted lines. And again, those are asymptotes. And so our lines are going to go from -2 to -1, or sorry, to +1. So our graph goes from negative infinity to -2. We skip over that -2, then it goes from -2 to 1. And notice how I'm only using the x values in here. Last section is going to be this section down here. Where does that section go in terms of x? Well, let's see. It starts at that asymptote there of 1, and it's going to continue going to the right all the way to infinity. So from +1 to infinity. That's our domain, and you can notice that we're actually skipping -2 and we're skipping 1. So we can actually see our asymptotes here are being skipped over in terms of x. It doesn't include everything, but it includes everything else. Our range does something quite different. In our range, we have to be really careful. Instead of using our x's, the range is kind of the one thing in interval notation in which we use the y values. So we still want to look at the same graph, but we want to look at it in terms of its y values. So let's kind of look at this as a whole. Instead of left to right, we'll look at this as down to up. All right. And so we really kind of want to look at this differently in terms of down to up, because that's really what the direction that our y values go. So let's look at all the way at the bottom of our graph. The bottom of our graph is negative infinity if it keeps going. And we can see that this has down arrows. So clearly this graph is going to go all the way down to negative infinity. So that's going to be kind of like the first y value we'd use, all the way down. And then as we work our way up for range, we're looking at all the y values. Our graph is good, our graph is good, our graph is good, until we get to this point right here. And this horizontal asymptote stops any upward movement. So we're starting at negative infinity and we go all the way up. And I said range was weird because range uses y values to -2. Now we're going to skip, because that's not the only part of our graph. And we can see that we actually skip a large portion here. Let's actually mark that real quick. We'll mark it in yellow. And the part of our graph that we skip is basically this whole section for our y. There's no graph in here. And since there's no graph in here, we don't want to include that for our range of values. So we went to -2, go up. And let's actually look at, see, where does our graph start again? Well, it starts, I don't know, somewhere between 2 and 3. Let's call that 2.4. Just an estimation. It'd be a better graph if maybe that was a perfect number there, but that's okay. And at that 2.4, then it continues to go up the rest of the way. Well, what y value would that be? All the way to infinity. And so really, you've got to now start making some generalizations in your mind about domain and range. We're talking about the entire graph in each scenario, but in one, we're reading it from left to right and thinking about what are those x values that the graph has. But for range, we're reading this from down to up and thinking about the y values that the graph has. So we're looking at the entire graph and we're trying to describe what values it has, what points exist on it in terms of x's and y's.